With the Cycles render engine selected up here at the top, let's enable rendered viewport shading so we can see what our simple scene looks like rendered. And as far as creating a material with Cycles, I'm going to make sure that my shader gizmo here is selected, as we can see defined in the bottom left corner. And just like Blender Render, we do have a material panel where I can create a new material. However, if you're familiar with the Blender Render material properties, you'll notice that this panel is quite different. Though it begins similarly, here you can see we have diffuse BSDF, which you can probably guess has to do with the base color of our object, which we can switch here. But what about our specular settings or mirror reflection, translucency? We don't see those options anywhere else in this panel. And so right from the start, you need to understand that Cycles separates all of our material attributes into individual components and requires us to mix together and layer these components into a final material. And so this panel user interface is not ideal for that approach. Instead, this is where the node editor comes into play. So when I switch into node editing mode, I like to adapt our user interface a bit. And that means to switch our 3D view here to the node editor. And then in order to still see our rendered result, I'm going to widen our properties panel a little bit and create a new window at the bottom, which I will switch to the 3D view. Now hit 0 in that viewport to go into camera perspective, and then zoom in a little bit and change to our rendered viewport shading. And so now that we have a much smaller window, it will render faster and also leave the majority of our screen real estate for the node editor. And so let's talk about the interface of the node editor. Here, the majority of the window is this grid-lined canvas where our nodes live. And these two things that you see are called nodes. We have the diffuse BSDF node and the material output node. You'll see that they are connected by this line, which is sometimes referred to as a noodle, and it's a visual way to show how the nodes are connected. Notice that this green circle is connected to the green circle. These little circles are called sockets, and in order to connect these sockets, simply drag from one all the way to the other. And we can connect an output socket, which is on the right side of a node, into an input socket on the left side of a node, however many times we want to. See, we have one output being connected into 3 separate inputs, all of which are color-coded to help you make more sense of which sockets to connect together. So the green sockets here mean they're shader-based, and this gray one is like a mathematical value. And over here on the left side, the input sockets of the diffuse BSDF, we have a yellow socket, which represents RGB values. Then we have another value socket or factor socket represented by the gray color, and then this bluish purple socket represents vector information. And even though, as you can see here, we have a green socket going to a gray socket, even though Cycles will, of course, allow this, the gray socket doesn't really know how to use the information from the green socket, and vice versa. But such incompatibility is not always the case. For example, RGB values and gray factor values can actually be used interchangeably fairly well. But we'll come back to that in later lessons. For now, I still just want to focus on the interface of the node editor. And so that's pretty much it for the nodes themselves. Over here on the right side of the window, we have the view properties, which can be enabled and disabled with the N key. And we'll go through these sections one by one. We have at the top the node section, which gives us the option to rename our node or add a custom label. By default, the name value will show up at the top of the node. And if we want to customize that, let's say my diffuse, the label overrides the display up here at the top. And then below that, we have color. In case we want to color code our individual nodes, we can do that here by first enabling the check mark and then selecting the color. And below that, we have the properties panel, which is just a duplication of what we see in the node itself. So really, that's kind of redundant information. Below that, we have a grease pencil in case we want to draw strokes or make notes to ourselves on the node editor canvas. We can do that there. And below that, grease pencil settings. And finally, the node wrangler. You will not have access to this by default because you have to enable it in your user preferences. So to do that, we'll go to File, User Preferences, and in the add-ons panel, let's type Wrangler in the search bar. Here we have the Node Wrangler add-on. Simply enable that to get these options and then save user settings. I highly encourage this add-on because it offers what I think are essential workflow speedups whenever working with the node editor. And so this is where those options live. Now, unless I'm changing the color of a node or the name of a node, I don't really need this panel, so I'll just hit N to hide it so that I have a little bit more space for my node canvas. And then like the 3D view, we also have a tool panel, and this is one of the spots where all of our nodes live. Everything from input nodes to output nodes, different type of shaders, textures, color nodes, vector, and the remaining tabs. This is where we can find all of our nodes, but it's just one place. And honestly, it's not my preference, so I typically keep that hidden. We can also add all of our nodes through this add menu at the bottom, where you'll notice the same names, shader, vector, converter. And then our third option for accessing all of our nodes is by hitting Shift A, which is my personal preference. And understand that the node editor is context sensitive. So right now we're on the material nodes as defined by this icon. To the right we have our image nodes, which is more commonly referred to as the compositor. And then finally we have texture nodes. And for each of these contexts, to the right we have further context. So if we go back to the material context, we have nodes for the object material, nodes for the world material, and then node for the line style. And so generally Blender is smart enough to auto set the correct context, but sometimes you may have to set that manually. And then to the right of this, we have the ability to create a new material. Hitting this plus button will create a brand new one, as we can see over here in the material panel. And we can also select a different material from the material library that exists in this particular scene. And so now that you're familiar with what the node editor is, in the next lessons we will explore how to construct a cycles material using these nodes.